Hi everyone, welcome to Miss McGuire's Read Alouds. I'm Miss McGuire, and today I have a special story for you. It's not a book like we've ever read before on this channel. It actually is an important book called We Are Still Here, and it's got a bunch of really special facts about the United States Indigenous peoples, the population that we sometimes call Native Americans or American Indians, and the United States government, and some of the things throughout history that have affected America's indigenous population and what they've done about it. So it's an important history book, but it's also really fun, a really fun picture book, and you're going to just love the way it is put together. Before we read it, though, I do want to give you some important words to focus on. Now, if you're doing this in your classroom or at home for homeschooling, this might be something that you really want to try out. Otherwise, maybe you just want to listen to these words and look them up later because you're curious, or you can skip this part. Okay, there's going to be some timestamps. So with that, I'm just going to share a whiteboard with you, and I'm going to give you some important words to look out for. And my suggestion with these words is that you write them down and then make a guess about what you think they mean. Okay, so write these words down, then make a guess, write down what you think they mean. And then I want you to listen to our story, and you can do this all at the end, or you can pause throughout. And when you hear these words in the story, decide if maybe you want to stick with what you thought they meant, if that makes sense in the story, or if you want to change your guess, okay? And then hopefully at the end of it all, you're going to actually look these words up and learn what they mean, especially what they mean in regards to the history of American Indians, Native Americans, American Indigenous people. Okay? All right, so here we go. Here is our first word, Sovereigen. That's the word sovereign. Sovereign. Okay, pause if you need more time to write. I'm going to go on. I'm going to go kind of fast because I want to get through it. So the next one is Assimilation. Assimilation. Assimilation is that word. Okay. The next one, Allotment. Allotment. What could the word allotment mean? Okay, the next one also starts with A. This one might be the most familiar of them all. Activism. 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 Okay. 3 more. Revival. 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 What does the word revival mean? Okay. The next one also starts with R. RES. URGENCE. Resurgence. What does resurgence mean? Okay, remember if this is fast, pause it, make sure you get these written down. And the last one is SELF, self dash DETERMINATION. Self-determination. Self-determination. Okay, so if you're doing this activity, hopefully you've got those written down. You're going to pause the video, write what you think they mean, and then unpause the video and go on to the story. So here's our story for today. We are still here. Native American truths Everyone Should Know by Traci Sorrell and illustrated by Frenae Lessick. Oh, this is kind of an important thing to see. Here they are all going into Native Nations Community School, and it is Indigenous Peoples Day presentations tonight. Okay. Our Native Nations have always been here. We are indigenous to the continent now called North America. Our leaders are sovereign and have power to make rules. Our ways of life changed when white people arrived from Europe. In 1776, white people broke free from England and created their own country called the United States of America, which affected our lives even more. Like European rulers before them, the leaders of the new U.S. government signed legal agreements called treaties with our native nations. These treaties recognize the sovereignty of our native nations to exercise control and power over our people and lands. But some treaties force native people to leave our homes or sell the lands where our ancestors lived. The U.S. government made promises to Native nations in almost 400 treaties altogether, but the federal government did not always keep its promises to the tribes. Most of the time, their laws and policies have been devastating. Most of the time is the important part, right? Most people do not know what happened to Native nations and our citizens after treaty making stopped in 1871. Despite the continued occupation of our homelands, regular attacks on sovereignty, and being mostly forgotten in U.S. culture, Native nations all say, we are still here. Here it says, Indigenous Peoples Day Project, 10 minutes each. And each student has a different category or topic that they're going to cover in their presentation. Winona's presentation, Assimilation. Most U.S. leaders did not respect our ways and thought it would be better for us to adopt their beliefs and practices. From the country's earliest days, white men sought to weaken our native nation's power to govern, destroy native families by taking our children away and sending many to boarding schools, outlaw our sacred practices, punish us for speaking our own languages. Even under these harsh laws, Native nations say, we are still here. Key's presentation, Allotment. White people wanted to control and sell even more of our tribal lands. Native nations had already given up larger pieces of land for smaller ones in treaties. In fact, the United States passed laws that divided up the remaining allotted lands of many tribes, gave a certain amount of land to each tribal citizen, sold the leftover land to white settlers and railroad companies. In spite of all this, Native nations say, we are still here. Tasbaw's presentation, Indian New Deal. The U.S. government tried to help many people during the Great Depression, but its leaders saw how badly Native people suffered compared to others. Knowing that, Congress crafted a series of new laws that protected tribal culture, arts, and crafts, allowed Native languages and traditions to be taught in schools, set aside money to buy back lost tribal lands, changed most tribes' governing systems to operate more like the U.S. government, which was not always helpful. Noting these new laws, Native nations say, we are still here. Chase's presentation, Termination. In order to save money, the U.S. government decided to stop honoring treaty agreements with more than 100 Native nations. This terminated our relationship with the federal government and no longer allowed our tribes or citizens to be legally separate in the United States. Although our tribes kept their part of each treaty, the United States stopped working with the tribal leaders, sold the affected Native nations' lands and resources, lowered the government's financial duty to tribes nationwide. With the return of these anti-sovereignty policies, our Native nations say, we are still here. Here they have some signs. This is Indian land, Menominee March for Justice, honor our treaties. And here it says, Legend Lake, you can own land in the Menominee Nation, choice lake property available. So there was a treaty that promised this lake property to the Menominee people. And then during the termination period, the U.S. government said, we're not going to honor that treaty anymore. We're going to sell these lands. Katie's presentation, Relocation. The federal government wanted us to leave our tribal lands and live and act more like white people. So Congress passed a law that pushed aside the fact that Indigenous people are separate under the law with rights as citizens of our native nations and of the United States, encouraged us to move to cities far from our tribal homes, promised jobs and schooling to those who moved, led to populations of poor Native people with little support in cities and suburbs. Even with our people scattered throughout the country, Native nations say, we are still here. Jesse's presentation, Tribal Activism. Native citizens continue to speak up, organize, and increase our longstanding commitment to strengthen tribal sovereignty, speak out about termination and relocation, recover our lands and harvest traditional foods, draw attention to Native people's lack of sufficient health care, help students go to college, including on tribal lands. With our collective voice and presence, Native nations say, we are still here. And so this is a famous place called Alcatraz Island, where there used to be a prison. And it says, Indians welcome Alcatraz Island. And here he's crossing out United States property and saying Indian land. So their activism led to them getting Alcatraz Island back as Indian land instead of being a part of belonging to the United States government. Will's presentation, Self-Determination. Native nations needed more control of our own lives, so we pushed back on federal rules that oversaw nearly every part of life on our lands. To support tribal sovereignty, the United States passed laws that recognized that our governments could handle our own affairs, helped Native nations offer programs and services directly to our citizens, restored many terminated tribes to federally recognized status, allowed some tribes to recover lands lost during allotment and termination. While pressuring Congress to carry out these laws, our Native nations repeatedly say, we are still here. DJ's presentation, Indian Child Welfare and Education. Native nations care about the welfare and education of our children. We needed to stop officials in various states from removing thousands of our children from their families and placing them in non-Native homes. Native nations prompted Congress to approve laws that blocked state officials from taking our children without notifying our tribe, focused on Native children staying with family or other tribal citizens, addressed the specific education needs of Native children in our communities. To protect and provide for our future generations, Native nations say, we are still here. Maya's presentation, Religious Freedom. Native people challenged federal and local laws and policies that had banned us from freely practicing our traditional religions. Native nations sought help from the U.S. Supreme Court so that we could practice our beliefs and ceremonies, tribes could access sacred sites outside our lands, tribal citizens could keep and use sacred objects. When the court did not support us, Native nations sought support from Congress to say, we are still here. Ella's presentation, Economic Development. Tribal leaders noticed our people failing financially, while others in the United States succeeded. Some Native nations opened casinos as a way to make money on our lands where few opportunities existed. This type of business allows those tribes to vary how people earn a living and care for themselves, use profits to develop businesses and employment, pay for important services like police, fire stations, and healthcare, offer scholarships and after-school programs, as well as operate tribally run schools. Even though the federal government regulates tribal casinos, Native nations say, we are still here. Chugi's presentation, Language Revival. Native nations want to increase the number of tribal language speakers. This is necessary to pass on values, stories, and ceremonies to future generations. Seeking to preserve our cultures, Native nations urged Congress to approve laws to encourage teaching Native languages in schools, allow our Native speakers to teach in classrooms, give financial grants to tribes and schools for language programs. Speaking Indigenous languages strengthens our heritage, so each Native nation says, in our own language, we are still here. Here it says Cherokee Syllabary, Sequoia, Cherokee Seal. Look at if you recognize any of these symbols. Some look like letters and others are a little bit hard to recognize, huh? New. Okay. Chance's presentation, Sovereign Resurgence. Having survived disease, war, and federal rules meant to destroy us and our way of life, Native nations continue to exercise our sovereignty. Together, we take action to speak up for the land, water, and resources everyone needs to live, look after our citizens' health, education, and safety, share information with the United Nations about our treatment in the United States, work together to shape federal and state policies that affect our citizens. All the while, we say, we are still here. Says Indigenous Peoples March, be part of the movement, be part of history, be part of the change. Respect Indigenous sovereignty. Say no to racist mascots. Native nations rise. We exist, we resist, we rise. I like that one. Water is life. Native lives matter. Indigenous strength. I don't think I can read that one way in the back, but I think it's talking about lands. It might say our lands. Here it says Indigenous Peoples Day. Welcome to presentation night. Everyone's got their presentations out. This is very small writing, but you might want to pause the video and see if there's anything here. There's some great information on this page. Here's a timeline of U.S. policies towards America's Indigenous peoples. Okay, I hope that you enjoyed that. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.